Well, hello and welcome to the Dorian Fisher Memorial Essay Competition run by the Institute of Economic Affairs. My name's Steve Davies. I'm the Head of Education at the IEA. And what I'm going to do in this short presentation is to tell you something about what the essay competition is, how it's organised and what is required for each of the three elements that it consists of. And thirdly, I'll give you some introduction to the kinds of questions that are being asked this year and the sort of issues that you should be thinking about depending upon which one you try to answer. So this is an essay competition aimed at people who are either in the final years of secondary education or are graduated from secondary education, but not in higher or further education. So it's open to anyone in secondary education, regardless of whether or not they're doing a particular syllabus, or even regardless of whether or not they're actually studying economics. You just have to be interested in it. It is not open, however, for university students or people studying a tertiary level qualification. So that's the main requirement. It's also open to people regardless of which part of the world they live in. So if you are a student in the Far East or South Asia or Africa or indeed any part of the world, you're perfectly eligible to take part in this competition. Now, the point of the essay competition is to ask people to think about questions and topics that may not be discussed or covered regularly in the standard secondary level syllabus of economics. So it's intended to, on the one hand, help you use and draw upon the kinds of knowledge and skills that you've already acquired in the course of studying economics at secondary level, but also to push the boundaries a bit and to go beyond the kind of standard materials, answers and arguments that you're expected to use during the examinations and other assessment modes of secondary economic education. So you should think of this as being a way to, if you like, spread your wings a bit and try and explore and think about questions that you might not otherwise be asked to face, and to take the toolkit that you've acquired from your education and the knowledge that you've acquired and apply it to other questions. Now, the competition is organised in the following way. There are three elements that you have to submit if you wish to enter the competition. You have to do a standard 1,500 or 1,200 word essay, a standard essay length contribution in answer to one of three questions. And I'll go through the three questions that we've had for this element this year in a moment. You also have to do shorter 500 word answers to one of three other questions. And finally, there's a third question, which also requires a 500 word answer, which asks you for your thoughts about how you might improve the secondary level syllabus that you're involved in. What do you feel it's lacking in, and what would you add to it, perhaps, to improve it, and why would you do this? So that third element is quite straightforward, really. It's a way of asking you how you feel about the course of study you're engaged in and where you think it's lacking and how you think it might be improved. Now, the first set of questions then are standard essays. One of the things that we will do is make available on the IEA website suggested readings for each of these topics. Now, these are not exclusive or final. You should also make use of any other readings that you're able to find or which catch your interests. And of course, much of the readings and material you've looked at in the course of your studies will also be relevant for these. But you are expected to do research for these essays, to read around the topic and the question that's raised by the question itself. Now, we have therefore three questions, which I'll go through quickly and say something about what kinds of questions these are about and what exactly they're asking about. And as I say, all of these are questions that are relevant to the kind of material you have studied, but they're not typically part of it. So the first question is, what challenges do systemic risks pose for economic thinking and analysis? So systemic risks are risks that pose a threat to an entire economic system, or even perhaps the existence of life on this planet. So systemic risks range from things like the collapse of the banking system, something that threatens to undermine the entire economic order in either the entire world or a significant part of the world, to, at the other hand, things like an asteroid striking the planet, or, highly topical, a major and lethal pandemic or natural disaster of some kind. And the theory of systemic risk is a well established one in sociology, economics, and mathematics. And it does pose particular problems for economists and economics, which is what we're asking you to think about. Because one of the problems is the quite simple one of how to work out what the likelihood of a systemic risk happening actually is. This is often very, very difficult by the nature of the thing that we're talking about, because systemic risks are typically low probability events that have major and far-reaching consequences and effects. But in some cases, it's even worse than that, because there's a degree of radical uncertainty. It's almost impossible to work out what the likelihood of the risk actually is. You can also get things badly wrong if you use the wrong way of assessing probability, something that the author Nassim Nicholas Taleb, for example, has written about extensively, and he's one of the authors that you should be thinking about when considering this. But there's also the question of whether or not, and under what circumstances, it's worth hedging against or preparing for the likelihood of a systemic risk actually happening. Economists always consider the trade-off between costs and benefits, but that becomes particularly tricky when you're dealing with systemic risks. And so one of the things that you do need to think about if you answer this question is that of how you do this. Should you adopt a precautionary principle, for example? On the other hand, if the probability of the systemic risk you're thinking about is sufficiently low, does it actually make sense to incur the costs of preparing for it? So there's a whole range of issues related to this question to do with things like the trade-off between costs and benefits, the degree to which the future is knowable, and above all, the degree to which you can assign known values or probabilities to a whole range of outcomes and their consequences. So that's the first question. The second question is, are economic principles applicable in and true in all times and places, or are they historically and contextually specific? Now, this is actually a very famous question in the history of economic thought, because it was the subject of an enormous debate that took place mainly in Germany in the later part of the 19th century, which is why it's usually known by its German name, the Methodenstreit, or methodological controversy. And this was an argument between the so-called historical school of German economists and the mainstream of the German economics profession. Now, one view is that economics is true no matter which period of history you're talking about, no matter which part of the world you're talking about. The principles of economics, of scarcity, supply and demand, the role of prices, these kinds of things, they're true in ancient Greece just as much as they are today in the contemporary world. And so the argument is that with economics, you're dealing with something which in some ways is a science. It deals with principles, rules that apply always and everywhere. Now, the contrary view is that actually the way economic relations are organized, the way economic life, production, distribution, exchange is organized and takes place, is historically specific and contingent. The way it works in one time period and one place may not be replicated in other times and other places. Now that, on the one hand, makes things more interesting, you might say, because it means that you have to actually do a whole lot of economic history and anthropology, as well as thinking about economics in the abstract. But it also makes it much more difficult, because it means that in order to understand what is going on, what is possible, what is not possible in a given time and place, you have to do a whole lot of work other than simply think about economic principles. So this is a very big question in economics. Is it the case that the principles are generally true, or are they really a function of precise historical circumstances, so that the way economic actors react and behave in one time is not necessarily going to be reproduced in another time? So that's the question you're being asked to think about there. As I say, one that attracted a lot of attention from a lot of seriously formidable intellects over 100 years ago in Central Europe and elsewhere, for that matter. And the third major question is, what does the term innovation mean in economics, and why is it so important for economists? Now, the second part of the way is the easiest part of that question to answer, because you can explain really why economists think this is important. And it's worth saying, and this is something I expect some of you will discover if you do this question, that it's something that economists have become more interested in and more convinced of its significance, if you will, in recent years. Quite definitely, development economists in particular have come to focus on innovation in a way that was not true previously. But this is one of those terms which has a meaning in popular general use, which is different and distinct from the precise and specific meaning that economists give to the term. And innovation in general usage basically means something new. It means an invention, perhaps, or a discovery. But for economists, it means something more than that. It has a very definite meaning. Not all inventions and not all simply new things or novel things are innovations for an economist. So really what you're being asked to do in this essay is to clarify what the concept of innovation is. And of course, there's a whole number of very famous economists who have been associated with this question. Most famously, of course, Joseph Schumpeter, but he's far from being the only one. Or even perhaps in more recent times, the most important, even though he's still what you might call the father figure for discussion of innovation. So that's what the third question is about. Now, you've then, as I said, got three questions which ask you to give a short answer. Now, it's worth saying that these are exercises of a different kind to the first sort. The first set of questions, for which you have to write a standard length essay, are asking you to engage in an exercise of research, reading, and then digesting what you've discovered through the reading and research into a structured answer to the question, which is what an essay is. These second set of three questions are rather thought exercises. They're intended to provoke a process of thinking about economic concepts or ideas. They're not something for which you should be expected to do any research or reading. You might want to do that, but it should be really minimal, because what you're really expected to do in answer to those questions is to take the knowledge that you've acquired through your studies and to, given that knowledge, think, well, okay, what does this concept mean? How do we understand it? What is the actual implications of it? And to then answer that question in a very short form, as I say, 500 words. So the first question asks you, well, what are rational expectations and why do they matter? So again, it's asking you to explain the particular concepts in economics, what it is, and then also address the question of why this matters, which is not as straightforward as you might think it is. The second question asks you, what are the differences between classical and neoclassical economics? So this is a question, first of all, in a way, about the history of economic thought. It's asking you to say, well, okay, we talk glibly about neoclassical economics these days. That obviously implies there was something called classical economics. What was it? What is neoclassical economics? What is classical economics? And also, as it says simply, how are the two different? Because they are. There are quite big differences, actually, between the two. So it's asking you to think about this and to try and work out what you think the difference actually is. And then the third question is, what are risk and uncertainty, and how are they different? Risk and uncertainty are key ideas in economics, but as economists have known for well over 80 years now, they're actually quite different. Although in popular parlance the two are fairly similar or closely related, in economics the two things are distinguished very, very carefully, and that distinction is quite an important one for how you think about a whole range of things. So again, the question we have to think about is, well, what is risk? What is uncertainty? For economists, that is. How are those two concepts different, and what are the implications of that? So those are the things that you're being asked to look at in those second set of questions, which, as I say, are like thought exercises. And I've already explained what you do in the third question, which is to basically think about what you've done and how you think it might be improved. So I hope you find this helpful, and I hope you find doing the essay and taking part in the competition both enjoyable and instructive, and I look forward to reading your submissions as they come in. Thank you very much.